It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.
Hello and welcome to Planet Holyrood, the podcast for all things Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Record, and it gives me great pleasure to be hosting the third episode of our new daily podcast series, which is focusing on the general election. New episodes of Planet Holyrood will be uploaded each weekday between now and July 4th when voters head to the polls. Now, if you haven't listened in already, I would thoroughly recommend you take the time to go back and check out our first two general election specials, which saw Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner and SNP MP Chris Stevens join our regular podcast hosts Lorna Hughes and Paul Hutchin. But today, for our episode of Planet Holyrood, I'm joined by two of my esteemed colleagues here at the Daily Record. On the panel, we have Dan Vievers, who is the record specialist on the environment, as well as being part of the wider political team covering this year's election. Also joining us today is Andrew Quinn, who is the Record's Westminster reporter, and he usually spends his time following events down in London in the House of Commons, but for the duration of this campaign, he's back up the road here in sunny Scotland to keep a close eye on events here. In today's episode, the three of us will be looking ahead to the first TV debates of the election campaign. We'll also talk about Labour's big commitment today on defence, and we'll discuss the future of the NHS, particularly in reference to the exclusive story on the front page of today's Record. But without further ado, let's get down to it and talk about TV debates, specifically the STV debate, which is the first of the big showdowns which will be shown across the major broadcasters. Tonight's debate, they've got the leaders of the SNP, Scottish Labour, the Lib Dems and the Scottish Conservatives. But Dan, coming to you first, it's fair to say that not everyone is happy with the lineup of tonight's debate, are they?
No, I think most notably the Scottish Greens aren't very happy at all. They feel that they should have been included in this debate on the understandable grounds that they are one of the biggest parties in the Scottish Parliament. They were in government until very recently. They're ahead of the Lib Dems in the Scottish Parliament, but of course the sort of cold hard logic and why STV have taken this decision, which they have done every election going back to 2015, is because they don't think that the Greens are going to win any seats at Westminster because they never have before. And as far as the regulators are concerned, Ofcom, STV say this has got to be at least partly based on historical performance in Westminster elections. And that's what it comes down to. And it's funny if you trawl through the annals of this going back, 2019, 2017, 2015, it's almost like Groundhog Day. This happens every single election cycle. STV planned their debate. It's always the four main party leaders who have got seats at Westminster. It's always been SNP, Labour, Lib Dems and the Tories. And the Greens are always kicking up a big fuss about it. But so far, it's never once convinced STV to change their mind.
Yep. Ross Greer, one of the senior Green MSPs, and I quote here, he says it's outrageous that a national broadcaster would exclude us from their leaders' debate, despite the Scottish Greens having been one of the five major parties in this country for more than 20 years. But Andrew, as Dan alluded to there, the Greens' performance in Scottish politics, it really rests on Holyrood. They have a track record of getting MSPs returned via the list vote, and they did until recently form part of the Scottish Government. But when it comes to Westminster, Green voices, there's only been one Green MP, Caroline Lucas famously in Brighton. The Scottish Greens are nowhere, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to win any seats this time round, unless bar like a huge upset, because first past the post, they're always going to be miles behind Labour and the SNP or the Tories or the Lib Dems, depending on where they're standing. In fact, usually they don't really stand in that many seats, but this time they're standing in over 30 seats. So I guess they're having a bit more of a go at it. But unless something dramatic happens are not going to win. And even then, there's only real specific areas where they very potentially could win it, a very outside chance, and that would be maybe in Edinburgh North and Leith, and in Glasgow South or Glasgow West or something like that. So I don't think it's too harsh to not have them in the debate.
And the Greens, I'm sure, will appear at one of the debates in the future because, like other general elections, there is no consistent format on how these telly debates are done. Tonight we have the Scottish leaders of four parties, at least, appearing on STV. Tomorrow, we'll come on to this in a moment, we have ITV's primetime blockbuster between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But to come back to you, Dan, now, the three of us, we follow politics for a living. You know, we're duty bound to watch anything like this on the telly. But do you think that there will be much interest in this? Is that fair to say? Do you think voters have caught up to the fact that we're now in a general election campaign and will be tuning in tonight to check out what's been said?
It's funny you should ask that because I was just out last week doing the first of my series of general election profiles, and I went to Glasgow East and spoke to voters, and my overwhelming impression was that they are almost past caring at this point what politicians are getting up to. They're so tired of politics, they're so tired of all the politicians that you do, as always with elections, voter interest will probably mount the closer we get to polling day, but to many people I think it still feels like it's only just started. And to what extent anyone's going to be bothered about tonight's debate will kind of, it will depend, I suppose, on the quality of the debate and if there are any really big moments in it. I think probably we've watched so many of these debates down the years, we know ourselves that most of the time nothing that interesting happens, but occasionally something interesting does happen which might permeate for the campaign down the line. You know, I think the one that always gets quoted is that 2015 debate where Nick Clegg briefly won over the nation with Clegg Mania, which seemed at one point that it was going to do something for him in the polls, and then eventually the final result didn't really show much of that. Although they did go into government obviously after that, and then, you know, obviously it's totally different context. But the year before, this was an STV debate actually, the independence referendum debate between Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling. I mean, it's for the sort of the commentators and the historians to look at to what extent did that debate make a big difference, because Alistair Darling clearly won that debate and he had Alex Salmond on the ropes, and to what extent that permeated through the rest of the campaign. It always felt like after that the Yes campaign was fighting on currency. So these debates can have an impact. But then just one other example, that's all right. 2017 for us hacks was quite a memorable moment where Nicola Sturgeon said that the then Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale had essentially privately revealed to her that she was more amenable to independence if Brexit was going to happen. But that didn't really change much at the end. It was a good headline. Most of the time it seems like these debates don't do much to the polls, and they're obviously very, very choreographed as well.
Andrew, in terms of tonight's debate, and also I should say that BBC Scotland will be hosting a event with all the Scottish Party leaders from Holyrood next Tuesday. What are the sort of key messages that you think that John Swinney of the SNP and Assar of Scottish Labour, I mean, they're the two parties that are going head to head in the sort of fiercest election clashes of this general election, you know, across the Central Belt. Polls suggest that the SNP could be on the verge of losing perhaps dozens of MPs. We'll of course wait and see what polling day brings. But if we're going into tonight's debate and going into future debates, what do you think is the key messages that John Swinney and Assar will be hoping to get across to voters?
So, they're both really trying to bash the Tories. They're both trying to say who can do the most damage to the Conservatives. And so the SNP's main line is that they can get rid of all Tory MPs in Scotland. Now, there's 7 Tory MPs in Scotland currently. Labour aren't going to get rid of 6 of them. They might get rid of one of them, but they're not going to get rid of a whole group. So technically that weighs up, but really Labour are arguing that they're the ones who can actually form a government. And if you vote for Labour and you get a Labour MP, there's actually a chance they could be a government minister, which is true. I mean, there's some of their candidates are pretty likely to be government ministers, if not straight away in the future. So we've got like Douglas Alexander standing in East Lothian, Kirsty McNeil in Mid Lothian, Ian Murray in Edinburgh South is already the Shadow Scotland Secretary. He's very likely to be in the cabinet. So that's what Labour are really saying they'll do. They're both kind of fighting to say who's more left of centre than the other, but no one's trying to be too radical. So the SNP have said, I think it was in the record, John Swinney said that they'll pull Starmer to the left. But then Labour are saying, well, actually the SNP don't want to tax oil and gas giants, so how can they be in the left? So they're very much fighting for being the main centre-left party, which will win. Whoever can prove themselves to be that main centre-left party will win most of the seats. It's essentially how the SNP won so many seats off of Labour, because a lot of folk thought Labour hadn't really done enough, or Labour had gone too centrist. So that's where most of the seats are going to be earned. But for the SNP, it looks like that's probably going to be quite difficult. The polls are showing the tide is kind of turned on them, and that Labour are likely to pick up pretty much all the seats in the Central Belt. So for Swinney, he's really trying to claw back some ground. He knows he's going to lose seats, but he's trying to reduce how many he's going to lose. And he's said his personal brand is popular. Some polls have also said that as well. So he'll be trying to get that across.
Andrew, just keeping with you for a moment. We obviously have the first head-to-head tomorrow night on ITV between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Now, that's obviously going to reach many more millions of voters across the UK than tonight's STV debate. But how much of an impact do you think that a Sunak-Starmer doubleheader will have in Scotland? John Swinney last week, he'd said that he should have been invited, that he's the leader was the leader of the third largest party in terms of MPs. Of course, there are currently no MPs after the 2019 Parliament was dissolved. But on the basis of the 2019 general election, John Swinney argued that he should have been involved. He's obviously not. It's just going to be Sunak and Starmer. But do you think that it could have much role to play in the election up here?
I mean, I do think it will. There are two options for Prime Minister after the election, and it's Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So I think it is important to have the two of them go head to head, the two people who are vying for governance of the country. And if John Swinney had been there, it would have been a bit of a distraction, to be honest, because he's not fighting for however many percent of the vote, 90% of the voters, you know what I mean? He can't try and win any of those seats because they don't stand in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, the SNP. So it would have been a bit of distraction in that sense. It is also important that voters get the opportunity to see the two folk who are battling to be leader of the country go head to head. Also, though, Swinney's not an MP either, and this is a general election, so he's not actually fighting a personal election at the moment as well.
Yeah, I know that is just a final point to make. Tonight's debate kind of features uniquely for people who are not standing in this election, but obviously here in Scotland, politics is a multi-format subject of discussion. But let's leave aside TV debates for now and talk about something a bit more heavy duty. Now, obviously, when it comes to politics in Scotland, we have a clear demarcation between issues that are reserved to Westminster, and MPs have the final say on them, and also we have issues that are devolved, which MSPs at the Scottish Parliament have a say over. But one of the big ones that is reserved to the UK government, and therefore is what general elections are all about, is defence. And Keir Starmer had a message today on that issue, and it's something that all people who want to be Prime Minister, they say a variation of this at some point. So Keir Starmer said today that he would be prepared to use nuclear weapons if needed to defend the UK. Now, this ties into a sort of broader discussion about the UK's nuclear deterrent, which, of course, is based just 30 miles from Glasgow, down at Faslane and Coolport. But Starmer has also committed a future Labour government to replacing the current Trident fleet of nuclear submarines. Now, that's already been voted on, so it will go ahead in some form, you would imagine, under a Labour government. But we're talking big sums of money. We're talking north of 60 billion, probably higher than that in the end. But the issue is obviously very complex because here in Scotland, the SNP and the Scottish Greens are very firmly opposed to the whole idea of nuclear weapons, and specifically Trident in general and it being replaced. Dan, as an environmental reporter, this kind of strays into your territory as well. I mean, nothing has a bigger impact on the environment than nuclear weapons. Do you feel that this is an issue that could kind of catch here in Scotland? Do you think that this is something that may focus voters' minds?
It's certainly an issue that people in Scotland, especially in the west of Scotland, can feel very strongly about. We've got a storied anti-nuclear weapons campaign in Scotland going back decades, and as you say, the SNP, who have become the biggest party in Scotland, have long opposed nuclear weapons, even nuclear power. It goes back a long way, and you do wonder how what Sir Keir's been saying today will be received by a lot of the voters, as Andrew was saying, that Labour are now trying to win back in their former heartlands in the west of Scotland and so on. It really does resonate. But of course, there are lots of voters in Scotland who do support the nuclear deterrent, and especially in the areas where it supports jobs. Helensburgh and areas around there is quite high levels of support for it. So it does cut both ways. And it is one of those, you said this at the start, Chris, when we introduced this topic, but I do think this election can get quite muddied between what's reserved and what's devolved. But this is very clearly something that is reserved. And it's kind of the sort of things that we should be talking about in this election rather than health and education when it comes to Scotland. To what extent?
Andrew, sorry, Dan, I was just going to bring in you, Andrew. What's the view in Westminster of Labour and Keir Starmer in particular when it comes to defence? Because defence is traditionally an issue that the Conservatives were viewed as being the strongest on. Do you think that Keir Starmer has done enough to kind of reassure voters, and perhaps in England and elsewhere in the UK, that because under Jeremy Corbyn, the party defence was a real weakness for Labour. Do you think he's done enough to kind of, dampen that down?
Well, yeah, he's actually got quite a good opportunity here because Rishi Sunak isn't seen as particularly strong in defence. Former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who was a Tory MP, he complained about there not being enough defence spending, and so Labour are really trying to weigh into what is traditional Tory territory. But they're also, Starmer's trying to prove he's different to Corbyn. Now, Corbyn actually did support Trident begrudgingly when he was Labour leader, more from a jobs point of view than anything. He knew he would lose union support if he said he wanted to get rid of it. But Starmer's trying to show that he's different to his predecessor, but he's also kind of going on these traditional, perhaps a little bit socially conservative sort of thing, or conservative with a small c, where defence is a really big issue, and he maybe understands it, perhaps maybe not so much in Scotland, but in large swathes of England, defence is a huge issue which determines how people vote as well. And Starmer obviously knows this is important because he wouldn't be pledging so much money to it otherwise. When Labour are playing with a pretty tight budget at the moment, he wouldn't do that. He knows it kind of plays into a bit of patriotism as well, and he knows it's very important and can be a vote winner. So that's essentially why he's going for it. But the unions up here though are quite for Trident because it does employ thousands of people. I've got mates who work in Faslane. I know quite a lot of folk there. So if it did go and if it went away straight away, it would be disastrous for lots of folk in the west of Scotland.
Yeah, I don't think we can underplay purely in employment terms how important defence spending is in the west of Scotland. I mean, not just in terms of nuclear weapons, but in terms of sort of conventional defence like the Royal Navy. The Government Scotstoun Yards here in Glasgow currently engaged in a massive frigate building programme. And as you say, Andrew, unions, particularly the GMB, are very forthright in their support for defence jobs. So definitely a big issue in this election campaign. Just to move on to our third topic, Dan, you mentioned the kind of muddying of the waters we get in Scottish politics, which can be confusing for voters and indeed journalists as well when it comes to deciding who exactly is in charge of what. But health and our NHS, now, on the face of it, I think most voters understand that is wholly devolved. That means that the Scottish Parliament calls the shots, it deals with the health boards and deals with the NHS managers, but it's the Scottish Government that's driving policy. However, of course, the majority of the Scottish Government's revenue still comes from the UK government, and due to our convoluted funding formulas, which we won't go into detail here, uptick in spending in health in England would have a corresponding knock-on effect in Scotland. Now, the Daily Record, our front page today, Stephen Flynn there, he's making his voice claims that he's saying that his party is the only one that can be trusted when it comes to the NHS and keep it in public hands. Now, the SNP have suggested that Labour at the UK level, if they got into power at Westminster, Labour would be very open to perhaps increasing the private sector involvement within the NHS. I mean, this is open to question and interpretation. The SNP said Labour are in favour of privatisation, a charge that Labour, I should say, pushes back against very, very strongly. So to come on to you first, Dan, what do you make of the SNP's claims on this? Do you feel that they're being credible when they say there's a threat of privatisation?
I think probably have to look at that very, very, if not sceptically, then thoroughly. Because, I mean, one thing that the SNP are using in this election campaign are things that the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has said, not just regarding the private sector, but in terms of the wider debate about what you were talking about a minute ago, Chris, regarding that sort of muddy area between devolved and reserved, and to what extent does Westminster funding necessitate how we handle our NHS. Wes Streeting said quite recently that in terms of funding the NHS, all roads lead back to Westminster, which is something that we've already heard John Swinney say during this campaign, and other SNP politicians will continue to say. I think, the SNP is able to, or is trying to use the NHS as an issue, maybe in part to distract from their own records on health in Scotland. In Scotland, we already have large and growing numbers of people who are having to turn to the private sector because of the fact that the NHS isn't working well enough. So I think all the parties have maybe some questions to answer on the NHS, and we should definitely consider all their claims with a sceptical mind. Okay,
and Andrew, you've obviously been out in the campaign trail the last week. You've been speaking to John Swinney, you've spoken to Anas Sawa. But on the Labour front, is this an SNP attack line that Labour should be worried about? Do you think this could maybe give Scots voters something to think about if they were considering switching perhaps from the SNP to Labour? Do you think the NHS could be something at the forefront of their thinking?
I mean, the NHS is definitely an issue that voters care about. I mean, in the UK, it's a bit sacred, isn't it? And there's never been any real proper privatisation of it, despite the costs going up every year. So the SNP are kind of trying to stoke fear a bit. I would say that Labour will do this. It does, yeah, as you say, it partly distracts from their own record, because I think most folk in Scotland know the NHS isn't as good as it used to be. And when you think about when it was better, it was when Labour were in power in Westminster. So really, that's because of Tory austerity is a large reason. Now, Scottish Labour will say SNP mismanagement is part of the reason as well. But it definitely will play into voters' minds. I mean, I think a large reason we are seeing a swing to Labour in general isn't necessarily to do with themselves, but it's to do with down south and up here. Public services aren't as good as what they used to be, and people want their public services to be better. People can kind of take a little bit of a hit in their own pockets as long as our public services are good, but when both are happening, it's a real struggle. I think an important point to make about the SNP is, since they've been in government since 2007, tens of thousands of private operations have taken place, or NHS operations have taken place in private hospitals. So they do use the private sector as well to, in a similar way to what Labour are saying they'll do. So it's quite an interesting tactic from them to raise that, because it's shining a light on their record as well.
Of course, I mean, the Scottish Government would argue that the NHS in Scotland, as it is across the UK, is under tremendous pressure, partly as a result of 2 years of COVID, causing backlogs in the system that the staff are still battling to bring under control. And as you alluded to, Andrew, there is also the question of the UK government spending on public services. You know, we've had over a decade of austerity, and the Scottish Government, of course, would argue, well, we're doing as best we can with the little money that we've been given. So I think the future of the NHS across the UK and also in Scotland will come down to brass tacks, who's going to spend more money. And Labour have certainly suggested that if they got into power, there would be more spending for the health service, and that would have a corresponding knock-on effect here in Scotland. But I think I'm going to use that opportunity to round things up for today's episode. Just a little bit of breaking news while we've been recording this is that Nigel Farage has said that he will be leading the Reform UK Party for the next 5 years. Whether that will have any impact in Scotland, of course, is open to question, given how little impact the Brexit Party, as Reform used to be known, had up here. But we now have Nigel Farage back in the mix, so to speak. So without further ado, I'd just like to say thanks to Dan and thanks to Andrew for joining me today on Planet Holyrood. And my colleague Paul Hutchinson and Lorna Hughes will be back tomorrow. So that's all for us tonight, and take care. Bye just now.
It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.